latest neuroscience shows us that we can actually see something happening in the brain when creativity is emerging. Just know this isn't conducive to creativity if it's not leaving any space or room to question.
Hi, welcome to Creative Minds Shaping the Future. I'm your host, Emma Palastanga. I'm an educator, author, and now podcast producer, curious to discuss a range of views on creativity and curriculum. Kavita Tanner is a classroom educator and co-founder of Catalyst Learning Labs, which guides school leaders and teachers through a cultural transformation that reconnects them to their original passion for learning, leading to increased student engagement and academic achievement. Her co-founder, Thompson Morrison, is author of The Dayton Experiment, which tells the story of a 5-year journey of reimagining the learning culture of a small rural school in Dayton, Oregon, that sought to unleash the creative genius in each student, empowering them to be the makers and creators of tomorrow. With Kavita's guidance, educators around the world and the young people they learn with come alive with curiosity, confidence and creativity, preparing students to be the empowered creative problem solvers that the world needs. So Kavita, welcome. Let's start by diving straight in with, how do you define creativity?
So I have to say that I've really enjoyed listening to the episodes that have gone live so far. So they were just brilliant, and it was really fun to listen to the different definitions that people are coming up with, sort of going to the etymology of it, going to their own lived experiences. And so I was like, oh, okay, like, why don't I take a different angle then? Because one of our good friends, Derek Peterson, he talks about the trivium of indigenous wisdom. So would say that's the etymology, and then the lived experience, but then also the science of it. And that's really become my sort of area of curiosity and passion recently, where it's like, well, what is really happening in our physical experience that's related to creativity? And it was like, oh, well, we are actually a manifestation of creation, right? So that's like, the basic thing, right? Like we are creation, like we are creativity. And so that's like my starting point. But then I was like, okay, in terms of living as a creative being, because, again, creativity is really a design, and sometimes, it feels very intentional, sometimes we're not really sure, but there's some element of bringing things together in a way that perhaps don't exist already in the world. There's some uniqueness flavor that comes with this idea of creativity. And so when we're thinking about that, I was like, oh, okay, so we have this physical human body, and we experience creativity because we are something that's manifested through creativity, and we keep doing that. Like, we keep recreating, we keep doing things that are new, we keep acting out in ways that are different. At least that's the world I want to live in, where when we wake up in the morning, and by the time we get to bed, we're not the same person. We've been somehow beautifully transformed in the way that we've created our own lives in that day. And so for creativity, for me, is really about being that agent, finding that way of being in charge of your own life, your own way of being, and knowing how to do that, because you have a fundamental understanding that there is something physical as well as perhaps spiritual, or thinking mind, or whatever happening, that allows all of these things to come together in a really beautiful way. And so going to the science of things, then, well, latest neuroscience shows us that we can actually see something happening in the brain when creativity is emerging, when we're having that moment that has been famously coined as the eureka moment. It's something we can actually observe in the brain now. And so you'll probably hear me refer to triviums a lot in our conversation today, because the number 3 is magical to me. But
Okay.
it's really about thinking about those 3 networks that we have in our brain, the default mode network, the executive network, and our salience network, and what's happening between those three that really, empowers us to become the creative problem solvers that we naturally are.
We'll probably allude to then knowledge and creativity. One of the things that really sparked my desire to raise the profile of creativity even more was that I had begun to feel that schools were focusing very much on knowledge at the exclusion of creativity. Yeah, people are feeling that we have to deliver this knowledge. We need knowledge organizers. We need to tick boxes, and we need to get this information into these vessels. And it doesn't sit well with me. So I wanted to kind of explore, did other people feel as I do, that creativity and knowledge go hand in hand and are both so important for our future? So, what was the inspiration for Catalyst Learning Labs? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Catalyst Learning Labs is a non-profit that was really created by a group of friends in Westerville, Ohio. It was literally a coffee shop, draw it out on a napkin moment type of thing. It was literally a situation where a good friend of mine, Linda Michi, who at that point was the middle school instructional coach across 5 middle schools, and well, it started as 4, but it's now 5 middle schools. She and I had met at the beginning of the pandemic, and when she came into her new role, called me up and said, "Hey, like, I'm in this new role now. Like, I really want to know what is exciting you at the moment? Like, what is the new thing that I can bring to the educators that I'll be working with?" Because her responsibility was going to be quite huge. She was going to be basically working with 700 educators across
Wow.
these middle schools. And so she really wanted to bring a new energy, it was a new role, no one had ever done it before. So she really wanted to make her mark on it. And so as a result of that conversation, we've been together since the beginning of the pandemic doing book clubs. And so I said, well, the book that I'm reading right now is pretty captivating. Shall I send you the link? So I sent her the link of the Dayton experiment that was written by Thompson Morrison in conjunction with Jamie Fluke, who was the principal of Dayton Middle and High School in Oregon,
Mhm.
and Ward Cunningham, who was basically coding the platform that the book was written in. Because we've all heard of Wikipedia.
Yeah.
That part of the Wikipedia being wiki is something that was originally coded by Ward Cunningham. And so it's been really fantastic to sort of be able to, be associated with him and actually write in the Federated Wiki myself now. So
Wow.
so it's really fun to be able to do that. And to actually become friends with and co-founders with Thompson Morrison. The Dayton Experiment was the book that I sent over to Linda.
Mhm.
She ended up staying up the whole night reading the book. She was totally enthralled with everything that was being described there. And I guess the essence of the Dayton experiment is really, really connected to what you were just describing about the connection between knowledge and creativity. And I guess what we would add into that trivium is the sense of curiosity. And what does it
Yeah.
mean to show up as a curious learner? The story is really capturing what happened when Thompson Morrison, having worked with some students in his own daughter's middle and high school, to sort of captivate the students' attention, increase engagement, have them do something that was purposeful and meaningful for themselves, because they created an app that would help them to sort through all the chaos of all the different clubs and societies and
Mhm.
extracurricular activities that happen in their school, to then go over to Dayton Middle and High and to sit with Jamie and say, well, what's going to be our audacious aspiration? What could we do that would be really incredible? And they both settled on, well, why don't we just reimagine education? Let's just reimagine it completely. And with that aspiration came the goal of, okay, and can we get all of these students, they had a roughly 80 something percent graduation rate. Can we get them to 100% graduation rate? And then when they presented this idea to the students, I think the student's name was Grace. She was like, yeah, but we can't just do this for us. Let's do it for the world. And so, you know, the audacious aspiration was set, right? And
Yeah.
so what happened was that, you know, they were able to really transform data middle and high school in lots of different ways. And I'll get into the details of that in a moment. But to circle back to your question, once you know, I'd read the book, Linda had read the book, and she was super excited. She was like, oh, can you come over to the US and, you know, let's speak at a conference about it and share this with, you know, as many educators as we can, because it's so inspiring, etc., etc. So I was in the UK at the time, and it was, you know, sort of still, you know, sort of pandemic-ish time. And so I looked up the price of tickets. It was like $4,500 or something. And I was like, mm. So yeah, so then I sent Thompson, because by then Thompson and I had become good colleagues. We had been speaking to each other every week since January 2021, and this is now sort of May, June 2022. And so Thompson, you know, went over to Ohio, presented with Linda in a very non-presenting way, because that's not how we roll. You know, it was very interactive, very, you know, like, let's gather everyone's curiosities, etc., etc. And then Linda said, right, that's it, we have to bring this work into the schools in Westerville. And so she sort of, you know, arranged everything for us to begin working with educators. We normally sort of work with pods of 8 educators at a time.
Okay.
And by the time we got to July 2023, she was like, oh, like, you know, you've managed to achieve so much online, and you've been able to come and visit and see, you know, sort of the impact of the work. We really need to do something. We really need to make this, you know, a movement, you know, much like the audacious aspiration of reimagine education around the world. And so at that point, Catalyst Learning Labs was born, with witnesses of Dennis Blair, Jessica Diallo, and Kristen Bordage. And yeah, it was a really beautiful moment of acknowledgement of all the efforts that Thompson Morrison had been making for, I guess, at that point, 10 years or so, and what Jamie Fluke had managed to achieve in the school. And then obviously the efforts that we'd made, because at that point we'd been to the US, to Australia, which was some work that Thompson had started before I got to know him. Then we took it to China, Ethiopia, Kenya, England, you know, sort of with Tina and Claire from episode 1. We'd started working with them in 2021 as well. And so yeah, so it's really sort of become a global movement. And so yeah, it's really exciting to be able to share where it all began. So thank you for asking that. Yeah.
No, it's a pleasure. It sounds really interesting. From one school and one student and those audacious aspirations, as you put it. Absolutely. If we imagine these incredible opportunities, then they do happen. If we make them happen, I don't think it just falls into your lap. We have to have a part of that. Um, I feel a bit the same with the podcast, actually. And I feel I'm learning so much from this incredible network of people. I feel a bit selfish, really. I'm getting a lot out of it for me, but I'm really hoping that listeners will also make links, make connections, and be like, yeah, I want to find out a bit more about XYZ. And I've got so many different presentations of creativity from people all over the world that it feels a really exciting place to be.
Absolutely. I can totally relate to that, because, you know, just the fact that you asked that question, like, what's the story behind Catalyst? Well, the story is a story of creativity. And, you know, that is one of our fundamental beliefs, that creativity is not a lonely endeavor. It's not something that happens just for that individual, you know, it's something that is deeply, deeply a connecting and connected experience. And sometimes, you know, we're being creative with people that aren't with us anymore, because, you know, it's the books that we've read, or the, you know, the philosophies that we've gone back to. And sometimes, and obviously for me being a bit of an extrovert, we get to create with people in real time and in the moment. And for example, I mentioned the dating experiment. There's going to be another book coming out. There's one in between about the time in Australia called The Joyful Sandbox. There's going to be one that myself, Tina, and Claire are co-authoring. We're hoping to launch that next summer. And then there's another book that is going to be co-authored by myself, Thompson, and Jamie. And Thompson and I had a chance to sort of speak before we met with Jamie, and we sort of loosely drew out a skeleton of what that book might look like, and then met with Jamie, and she said, oh, what about these ideas? And it was like, okay, I guess we're kind of back to the drawing board. Not that we've totally rubbed out all of the ideas yet, but but it became a moment of creativity because Thompson asked the question. She sort of, brought forth what was in her heart and mind. And, rightly so. She was like, we need to uplift the stories of the students. And we were planning to do that, but in a slightly different way than the way that she was suggesting. And so we were like, oh, okay. And so when Thompson sort of turned to me and said, so what's coming up for you, Kavita? I was like, I need a moment.
Collaboration is fantastic, but it can also be quite challenging depending on who you're working with. Yeah, if they're like-minded individuals, that's great and it can all bumble along quite nicely. But it's from that challenge actually that we learn and grow, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's the great thing about it, that, we all do have our unique perspectives. There's lots of references made quite commonly, I would say, about twins and how different they can be, but oh, they were brought up by the same parents in the same home, etc., etc. But that, we are all unique individuals, and that's really sort of one of the things that when I think about, shaping the minds of the future and sort of, really thinking about, well, what does it mean to be creative? Part of that creativity comes from all of us being curious about each other.
Yeah.
And when we are curious about each other, we're open to learning about each other and learning with each other, learning from each other, and learning through each other's experiences that are so unique, because they are, something happens in the brain where it's like, oh, like that's, giving me a new reality. That's sort of creating an opportunity for your brain to literally sort of say, okay, well, this is what I thought the world is, and now you've brought a different perspective. How can I adapt my own thinking and my own understanding of the world? And that in itself is a creative act, because you've got to then be in your default mode network, your imagination, your sort of ability to process in your executive network. And then what we've discovered with the latest neuroscience is activate that salience network in a way that's sort of saying, okay, well, now I need to accommodate new realities, and there's confusion because now I'm in chaos. How am I going to find the order? So you're oscillating between the chaos and order, chaos and order, chaos and order, and then all of a sudden, they've coined the term a neural avalanche. Now, I say they because I'm not sure whether it's Thompson that coined it or whether that's a neuroscience thing. But there's a term out there, neural avalanche. And, and when we're experiencing that, we can reach that state of criticality, where we can really experience that moment of aha, eureka, etc., and really feel like, oh, okay, I see the world differently now. Like I am different.
Yeah.
I've literally created a new sense of myself and the world that I live in, because, one conversation that we had recently was that there's a difference between the planet and the world. The planet is, Earth. We've been able to see the blue dot, right?
Yeah.
Thanks to all the, work to go out into space. But the world as a social construct is something different. And so it's interesting when you mention, like-minded people and how that somehow makes things feel easier. But is that really what we want? Do we want ease, or do we want to be alive? Do we want to be engaged? Because when we think about ease, we can, the opposite of that is dis-ease, right? And the aspiration that we're holding at Catalyst is that what if the aspiration wasn't to just try and cure the dis-ease? It was actually to look for that sense of coming alive, of feeling alive, of being alive, becoming alive, that aliveness. And so I guess I'm going to be courageous and say right now my aspiration is to undertake a PhD, and in that research what I'm hoping to be able to do is to be able to connect the idea that the way our heart beats and the fact that it's actually necessary for our hearts to experience irregular heartbeats at different times in our lives in order to, sort of keep that organ running and pumping, and is really an essential part of how we live, that we need to allow ourselves to experience surprise even at that basic level of being alive. And so so that connection between sort of, like a lot of people have recently been talking about the head heart hands curriculum. It's like, yes, and having that fundamental understanding of neuroscience, the head, but also understanding the importance of the heart in that journey in a very physical sense, as well as sort of the hands, and what is it that we do as a result, of what we're learning. Because with that freedom to learn comes a responsibility. And one of the thinkers that's had a lot of influence over me is Umberto Maturana, a Chilean biologist. And he never tried to define anything. He tried to explain things. And so his explanation of responsibility has always stuck with me, that it's to think through the consequences of our own actions on ourselves and on others, and choose to take a positive action as a result. And so when, we're talking about creativity and we're talking about our natural capacity to come up with new ideas and to sort of create new understandings of the world and things like that, we can lean a little bit on human systems dynamics of, okay, well, that's the what. Then we can ask ourselves, so what? And now what? you know, because I mean, Oppenheimer, the movie, was released fairly recently, and and there wasn't enough, in my opinion, discussion of the ethics of what happened in, with humans discovering the capacity to create so much damage and trauma. And yeah, I mean, visiting Hiroshima was hard. That was really hard last year, but we do need to sort of lift up that ethical conversation. We can't just have creativity for creative sake. We can't just think about creativity on the small scale of, well, I drew something, or I played something, or I made something with my hands, with some sort of model. We do actually need to think about, well, what energy are we now putting out there as a result of that creativity? What good can it do? How can it support our collective flourishing? And yeah, that's really sort of where we're at with this work.
Brilliant, thank you. And it connects nicely to my next question, really. I talked a bit about the knowledge-rich curriculum, and I feel a lot of educators, not everybody, but a lot, are feeling, yeah, I've got to get through the knowledge. How do you feel that creativity complements or works with, or doesn't, with that knowledge-rich curriculum? What's your take on that?
I feel so fortunate to have realized that I've been able to see so many countries in the world, and seeing so many different cultures, experiencing it with the locals, being part of all of that is new experiences. And those new experiences have given me a sense of knowing, a certain comfort, that like when I'd been to Kenya twice already. When I invited Thompson and his wife MB to come with us, I felt comfortable that, like, it's okay, I know what's going to happen here, and it's going to, like, all of that kind of thing. So knowledge is essential, in our very lived experience way, and also to be able to lean on the experiences of others to say, okay, well, I know that if I mix blue and yellow together, it will make green. Like, it's better to have had the lived experience of mixing it yourself, absolutely. But like, but there's a certain amount of predictability that, we all appreciate. Like, if someone writes me a note and they've written it, in characters that I can recognize and make sense of, then, it helps our communication, it helps our understanding. And so there's definitely room for bodies of knowledge, whether it's as a means of communication or as a means of understanding a shared reality. What I would say though is that the obsession, maybe we'd call it, of like, okay, just know this, know this, know this, know this, isn't conducive to creativity if it's not leaving any space or room to question. Making room for that curiosity of why is essential, I think. It's great to be able to be an educator that's well informed and has something to share with the students, and hopefully following sort of Parker Palmer's advice in his book Courage to Teach, of either being one of those educators that shows up for the love of the children and or shows up for the love of the subject. There's value in both of those styles of teaching, and also remaining open to the questions and the challenge and the possibility that your young children might see things differently. Like I had a friend who was colorblind, but no one was diagnosing that when he was at school. And so people would just get angry with him when he would say that something was a color that it wasn't, as far as everyone else could see. That's not helpful. It's like and so we have an opportunity really to open up that sense from our young people, their curiosities as it relates to bodies of knowledge. And so Tina shared the example of asking students, as it relates to maths, and I forget what the concept was, but we did it recently around volume and coordinate planes, that like, what is that? What do you think that is? What how does this connect to your life? Like, what is the relevance? And starting from that place of, no, our young people are not empty vessels. We don't need to fill them full of things. What we need to do is ask them, like, what are your lived experiences with something that we'd like to dig into a little bit more, and then to incorporate not only those curiosities, but also their general curiosities, whether it's sports related, ocean related, space related. It doesn't really matter, but like, if you can take the time to gather your students' authentic curiosities and then challenge them to find a connection to the one that's most recently present in my mind, volume. You don't know where they're going to take it. Like, we had one student recently who'd been assigned cylinders, and understanding the volume of cylinders as the sort of expert in the room about that, and he did it through explaining space capsules and what it would mean for one astronaut to be in a space capsule, and how the volume needs to be expanded to accommodate two astronauts, and it was really such a depth of understanding of the calculations of volume, the what volume actually means, like how it plays into that scenario. The whole thing was just incredible, and it's being with the students to create the conditions for them to be able to engage at that level that we hope more and more educators will allow themselves to do. So at the moment, we're super excited because more and more schools around Columbus in Ohio are sort of taking on this work. And we've now got not only St. Eb's working with us using the Designed Ingenuity Learning Framework, but also another school, Denston, up in Staffordshire. And, and we're hoping that it's going to be expanding more in England as well, because this really is transformative work. It's very personalized, very student directed, and deeply transformative, because in the last 3 years we've coined the phrase H cubed, which basically means those students that have got their headphones on, their hoodies up and their heads down. And the most magical moment is when that student starts to raise their head and the hoodie comes down and the earphones, the headphones come up, and they're like, wait a minute, I can do what? You want me to yeah, we want you to become, as one of the educators said, thinking beings.
Brilliant.
Yes, that's really what we want. We really want you to live into your creative potential as a human being, as the Homo sapiens that we are. And they're like, what, me? Like, Conversely, those kids that have figured out the game of school don't love it so much at the beginning. They're like, no, no, where's my rubric? Where's my, where's my checkbox?
Yeah.
How do I make sure I get an A in this? And it's like, but I can't emphasize enough the value of surprise, the value of having those moments where the educator, the student, all of us are co-learners together. And it's like, I never knew that Einstein had come up with a theory about white holes. Many of us are familiar with black holes. How is a sixth grader, which is around 11 years old, 11, 12 years old, teaching us about
Yeah.
Einstein's theory of white holes? Like, that could never have happened if we hadn't been open to the fact that his curiosity is space. So yeah, I guess there's a big emphasis in what I'm saying, I'm realizing, on space. And so maybe sort of referring to that, the work that was done by George Land would be appropriate. Are you familiar with that work?
I'm not, no.
Yeah, I think you'd really enjoy it, because what he was doing was that he had been invited by NASA to support them to find the most creative minds in their organization, because they really, they were in the space race, basically, right? They needed to get something out into space. And so as a result of the impact that it had had to, with his surveys and other things that he was doing to uncover that, he was like, oh, maybe we'll do this in schools. And so he took the questionnaires and the activities into schools, and there were Head Start schools, which is lower socioeconomic demographic schools. And what he discovered was that I think it's 98% of 5-year-olds were identified as creative, self-identified and identified.
Yeah.
And basically, as those young people were moving through school, your face tells me that you can guess what was
Familiar.
happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, there's a marked decline, to the point where the story goes, and at this point it's a legend, right? That teachers are like, nope, you're not doing that anymore. Nope. And
And
so yeah.
I think we as educators sometimes feel the pressure of accountability, and we feel that, oh gosh, I've got to prove this. Yeah, I need this written in the books. And I often say to people, why does it need to be written in a book? Why can't they make a video? Why can't they build a sculpture? Why does it have to be shown in one particular way? So as educators, I think we need to be open to these new ideas. And it also reminded me a lot of Ken Robinson. So Ken Robinson's work on declining creativity over the years. I know you're a fan. Many of us in this creative circle are fans of his. And,
Absolutely,
some,
absolutely.
and something you said earlier, I think when we look back at the knowledge and creativity, I've written a calculation down here. Knowledge plus curiosity, possibility, and connections equals creativity.
I love that, and I love how you think in such a similar way to me, because it's all about the equation. So there's something I want to go back to with, well, why can't they make a sculpture and all of that, but
Yeah.
also the accountability piece. And then I want to circle back to the formulas, because in terms of the creative artifact, we call it, that's our sort of phrase, if you like.
Mhm.
The creative artifact is part of the agentic part of learning, because in you being given the freedom and the responsibility, but being given the freedom to demonstrate your learning through something that's meaningful to you, is because of the hands part of it, because you physically got involved, you are more likely to retain that knowledge as a lived experience, as something that you'll think of fondly. And actually, lots of students might have, shelves of trophies, but imagine having shelves of all of your creative artifacts that symbolize all your powerful learning,
Mm.
ideally cross-curricular, in which you were held accountable for sharing a particular aspect of concepts in a particular unit of learning. So as an example, we've got examples from science of the students were invited to study different forms of land, so that had been created through glaciers. And so, there's the gymnast that created the video where she actually demonstrated how all of the different landforms, the eskers, the moraines, all of that were formed through her gymnastic moves. We've got others that, went into the neuroscience aspect of it. And so they made a model of a brain, they were like really sort of digging into, okay, well, how did these scientific concepts connect to the things that I'm curious about, whether it's their passion for gymnastics, whether it's their interest in the way that the brain works, whether it's their interest in social community and how do I make better friends and things like that. But they created something. And they created something that not only will they remember as a lived experience of making it and sharing, but that their peers are going to remember. So in a maths class, after the framework had been applied, the teacher said, okay, well, let's see how they do in the tests, the end of year tests. And she was literally observing the students that when they got to a particular question about a particular concept, looking over at the child that taught them that concept so that they could replay their presentation in their mind, to be like, oh, and then she'd see them scribbling.
That's so powerful, isn't it?
It's just such a beautiful moment for her, to sort of be witness to, oh my goodness, like you really have shown up for each other. That is the kind of accountability we need, right? It's not, like pointing fingers and, sort of like, you didn't do the thing or whatever. It's like the accountability of, oh, I have a responsibility here to make sure that everyone in my class understands the things that I've learned.
Yeah.
Because then they're going to be able to apply it in their lives, because we can't, knowledge doubles every 12 hours right now. Every 12 hours. There is just no way that I can know everything or you can know everything. It's just not possible. We need each other to bring things to life. We just need that. And, and so that's, why I was laughing about the formula, because Viktor Frankl's work really impacted me really massively. He's, survivor from the Holocaust, and he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And in his book, he talks about the formula of despair equals suffering without meaning. And that just got me, right here in my heart. And I just, so I sat with it for ages and ages, and I was like, okay, but what's the opposite then?
I was thinking the same.
And so it's like, okay, well, it's suffering plus meaning. So, so we have that responsibility then to make meaning of the suffering. And then what might that lead us to? And so I've been sharing that with different people. And I think my friend was right when she said, yes, it leads to hope. But before we get to hope, there's a sense of wisdom. And that wisdom is that inner truth, that deep truth that we hold for ourselves, that, okay, I've been through hard times. I've been through things that, if I could rewrite my, my story of my life, I'd definitely delete those chapters. And I've come through because I've realized that, oh, maybe that happened for a reason. Maybe that happened to teach me something, for me to learn something from, for me to be different, that state of transformation where we're constantly recreating our own lives, our own selves, our own ways of being. And then, with that wisdom, we can experience the world with hope. Because, the hope is there for the taking, really, because if you can experience all of that and still come out on the other end being like, okay, I've made peace with it, you can be like, okay, I think I can be more resilient as a human. I can remain hopeful. I can look out to the world and say, yeah, like I can be with young children and say, the world is your oyster, and it's a beautiful place, and we're going to make something, and we're going to do something, and we're going to be people, that are constantly in a state of becoming, that really flourish together, because we have that connection that you put in your formula, which is really an essential part of this work. That, in order for me to be with you and for you to be as curious as you are being, which is beautiful, there was a connection made between you and Tina, I believe, from LinkedIn. And then, obviously Claire was brought in, and you all three connected together, and you're inspired to connect with me, be curious. And then, you know, we're having this courageous conversation together to say, hey, everybody, maybe the way that some of us are living, and so many of us are not, but some of us are living with that sort of straight line, you know, I've got to conform, I've got to comply. I know that I'm being controlled, but you know, as long as I conform and comply, then my life will be easy, and you know, and everything's going to be okay. Well, you know, that's what the deadline looks like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, the flat
and
line. Yeah.
that's the flat line, you
Yeah.
know, and that's not what we need our people to be. We need all of us to be, you know, in that state of aliveness, which means that we have some peaks. And when we go down, we have that opportunity to make some really deep meaning out of it and come back up again, you know, and be in that state of resilience, of bouncing back up again and being fully alive. That's what it's at.
Absolutely.
Let's all be fully alive.
We don't need education to flatline, do we?
No, we absolutely do not. You know, like it's heartbreaking because sadly, you know, there are some schools out there that are just that little bit too big or don't have enough connection, you know, between the adults and the students. Or, you know, like there was a study done, I think the magic number was 150, although recently I've sort of adopted the Fibonacci sequence number, which I think is 144, you know. And so, you know, but apparently we can't handle many more connections than that, you know, and some teachers are teaching 250 students in one academic year, and it's like, what are we doing? That's just not, it's just not feasible as a human to be able to be deeply connected to all those young people in a way that's going to create the conditions for everyone to make meaning of the learning. And the fact that learning is a roller coaster, you know, like if you're not feeling surprise, if you're not feeling like something is new to you, are you really learning, or are you just regurgitating the same stories over and over again? And we don't need that anymore. You know, we don't need the same stories to be playing out. We've learnt so much of the good things that have come of you know, industrialization and modernization and being in the new economy. We're also learning that actually there's been some fallout, there's been some consequences that perhaps we don't need to live with. Perhaps, you know, that missed moment in the pandemic when all the plastic factories got shut down and then reopened again. Who thought that was a good idea? Like, why did we do that? We actually shut everything down. You know, wildlife was flourishing again. You know, there was so much good that was happening, and then for some reason we went back to the old narrative, and I'm really not sure why. And to be honest with you, I think it's in the hands of our children, as well as, you know, curious, connected, courageous adults to write the new narrative. And that's really sort of where we sit now, as catalysts to say, let's rewrite, you know, let's write a new narrative together. Let's write the new story of what it would be to be part of a learning system. We're not even calling it reimagine education anymore, because education has now got other associations with it. It's now, let's create the new learning system. Call it what it is. It's places of learning. It's, you know, an opportunity for us all to be learning. And yes, you know, you might enter the learning pit sometimes of confusion and frustration and all of these things. And that's exactly where we need to be. And, you know, our young people are showing us all the time what's possible. And so I know we're coming towards the end of our time, but I'll just share a quick story with you of what happened 3 years ago when we just started that work in Ohio. And there was an after school club that was going to be starting called Future City. So the students, there were eighth grade students, there were 8 of them, and they had the opportunity to either design the city of the future for them, for their own city, for Westerville, to just make one up, you know, with all of the sort of you know, space things that kids come up with, you know, when they sort of get, you know, fully into an imagination. And then the option was given to them to work with a community that my husband and I had been introduced to in southern Kenya, 2 hours south of Nairobi. In the vote, 7 out of the 8 said, we'll do the community in Kenya. One of them said, guys, you realize that's going to be more work, right? But fast forward, 5 months later, that's in August. In January, it's the competition, and they're standing on stage. And he was the one that said, this is not about competition for us. This is about 2,000 people living in Kenya that we want to be able to support to get access to clean water. Now, because of their efforts, the Rotary Club is pledging to raise the funds so that that community can get access to water.
Wow.
And when we've asked those students, why are you still passionate about this? What has kept you totally engaged with this? It all began with curiosity. It all began because I had the privilege of showing up on a Zoom call with them and asking them, so what are you curious about? And because they felt seen, heard, and valued with what their curiosities are, and then invited to connect those curiosities to the needs and the desires and aspirations of these people in Kenya, they feel like all of our stories were felt. All of our stories have been honored. And we are now deeply connected to people that we hope to meet one day, but we don't know if we ever will. And so it's just been such an amazing experience to be able to connect with young people. The research, the ideas, the inspiration, all of the things that those young people were able to come up with in such creative ways, in such powerful ways that really will shape the future of real people, on the other side of the world, it has just been incredible.
I think there's also, in my mind, I'm making connections to Gavin McCormack's work on upschool.co, where there are
Yeah.
so many projects available to children to write their own book to change the world, and Evertreen, where they can plant trees in a country that they may never visit, but that will help others and have a real impact. The other thing I kept thinking of as we were talking was philosophy for children, the opportunities to be curious, to ask questions, to challenge one another, to have real deep and meaningful conversations and to learn from those. I think there are huge opportunities there. All the things that we're talking about as adult learners that the children can really benefit from too. What is next for you and Catalyst Learning?
Well, we're pretty excited because we're actually forming a partnership with a number of different school districts in Ohio, in England, and with a particular organization called Erase the Space, which is really resonant to some of the things that you were just saying, where it's encouraging educators in the Columbus area in Ohio to bring together their classes from different socioeconomic backgrounds, race backgrounds, things like that. And what they're hoping to do is to use our framework as and the initial experience, which we call the Spark Workshop. So it's a 1 week experience that, we basically are offering all the time. So if anyone's curious, we can share more information about that.
Mhm.
But to engage those educators in that 1 week experience to support their creative thinking about how to create the conditions for those young people to connect with each other more deeply, because that 1 week experience is basically the codifying of the powerful learning that was happening in a 7th grade classroom back in Dayton. So the teacher there, Jenny Shulhanak, had brought together the fundamental principles and understanding of pedagogy and teaching in a classroom,
Mhm.
taken that into her Genius Hour, and then had that amplified by some agile thinking from someone that was working at Nike at the time. And now, we've codified that to really sort of express the designed ingenuity learning framework as a way of connecting to the agile mindset. And so, Spark workshops are going to be running every week from July. We're going to be supporting educators to bring the dig, we call it for short, into their classrooms. And as mentioned earlier, we're going to be holding a conference here in England, hopefully in June or July next year. We're figuring out the logistics so that people from Australia and people from the US can join. So, but yeah, we're hopeful that that will be really popular amongst educators to come and be curious and make new connections and hopefully be courageous to embark on this way of being with their students in the classroom. So hopefully you'll be there with us, Emma.
Yeah, I'd love to join you.
And then I must also give a shout out to my friend Ellie Clark, who is just coming out in the world as a coach for school leaders. And she sent me a post recently from meeting 3 of her colleagues that had been through the Spark workshop and then guided 9th and 10th graders with me in Ethiopia through the dig. And all of their lives have been transformed in ways that really demonstrate the power of creativity and what happens when that's unleashed from within us, and how we really do design our own lives and shape our lives in different ways when we've had that opportunity.
Please send me links to the workshops. We'll put
Oh,
those in the show notes, then people can access those later on as well.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Emma. This is a wonderful opportunity to speak to you and meet you, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and enthusiasm. It's been really wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you found Kavita's thoughts on creativity stimulating, and you will consider what you are curious about, as well as asking, so what and what now? Next month, I chat with Timothy Wambi from Uganda.
We want to give back children power to be creative without instruction, without direction, thinking outside the box. I'm always thinking of ideas like every single minute.
I have some fantastic guests lined up. Some you will know and some you will want to know. I'm really excited to announce I'll be releasing this podcast once a month, and I'll be talking with philosophers, artists, mathematicians, scientists, engineers, innovators and educators. If this sounds like you, maybe you have a view on creative thinking or creative expression, please get in touch by following me at ACPC4A, the number 4, on X, or Emma Palastanger on LinkedIn to connect. Please subscribe to this podcast so that you can stay up to date on the release of each episode. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next episode of Creative Minds Shaping the Future.